A lot of popular avatar fashion has people wearing chain necklaces or jewelry or belts, which is cool and all, but a lot of times these chains have a lot more polygons than they should. I'm not going to cite any particular avatar as guilty, but I made some quick examples just to show you what I'm talking about. Even if we look at the lowest poly count of these examples I made, you'll see it's still 624 triangles, which is a lot, especially if it's on a small bracelet and it's going to be viewed from really far away. You don't need that many. In a lot of cases, we can make excellent looking jewelry just out of planes. You'll notice if you look at this model right here, most of the chains are actually hardly any geometry at all. But we can still make it look plenty three-dimensional with clever use of normal maps. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to make low poly chains that can be used on your VRChat avatar without killing everybody's performance. You're going to need three things: a plane, an empty object, and a curve. So let's start with a plane. I'm going to Shift A, go to my Add menu, look for Mesh, Plane, and then go into my Modifiers tab and add an array modifier. What an array modifier does is it takes our original object, in this case a plane, and makes copies of it. So right now I have 2 copies. I can turn it up to 5 copies. I can turn it up to 100 copies. And I can even add multiple array modifiers to array the array. Any changes I make to my original object will also happen to all the copies as long as my array modifier is still active. So once I apply the array modifier, you'll see they all become separate objects. If we look at what chain jewelry actually looks like, though, we'll notice 2 things. One, the chain links are overlapping, which ours isn't. And then also, as they overlap, a lot of times they rotate. So to do that, let's add an empty object to tell our plane how to rotate, and then also how much space should be in between each chain link. Let's do Shift A again to add an empty, and we want plane axes, but any of them will do. And then let's go back to our plane for a second. Once again, in the array modifier, you'll see that we have a couple different options we can choose from for offset. Offset controls the distance between all of the objects in our array, so in this case, all of our planes. Right now we have it set to relative offset of 1, which means each plane will start right after the next plane begins. If we increase it, you'll see there's a little bit of space between each planes. What we want to do is turn off relative offset and switch it to object offset. Under our drop-down, we can then pick any object to use as the source of our offset. So if we pick our empty, at first it looks like nothing happens. That's because our offset object is actually at the same exact position as our object we want to array. If we select our offset object, move it just a little bit, you'll notice what happens is these start to slide back and forth. So we're using this empty object to control the offset in our array. What we can also do is use it to control the rotation and scale. In this case, I don't really want to scale my chain links up and down, so I'm going to leave it as is, but I do want them to be rotated. So I'm going to rotate it slightly, and you'll notice it's compounding. So this one's rotated a little bit, this one's a little bit more, this one's a little bit more, all incremented by the angle our offset object is rotated at. I personally like to use a combination of this object offset and relative offset. So I will use our object to control the rotation, but to control the positional offset, I'll still use the relative offset and then just adjust the slider manually. So in this case, I think I want our chain to have 30 links in it. And as you'll see, it keeps rotating and offsetting all the way to the very end. So lastly, let's use a curve to give our chain some shape. Once again, going to Shift A for the Add menu and look for Curve. You can choose any type you like, but I personally prefer the Bezier curve. depending on the scale you're working at, when you spawn the curve in, it may be way too big or too small. If we look at our chain link, you'll notice that each link is actually 2 meters by 2 meters, which is way too big for a necklace. If we go to scale the plane down, however, you'll notice it does some weird things to the rest of our chain. And that's because our plane object and our empty object have mismatched scales. So as you can see in this panel right here, which you can open and close with N, the scale of our empty object is 1, but the scale of our plane is 0.696. If you select your plane and just Control A and apply scale, resetting that scale to 1, it'll fix it. You can also choose to scale your plane down in edit mode instead of object mode, which won't affect its scale. So let me just scale that down. And that looks much more appropriate size for a necklace. Now that the sizing of everything looks okay, let's change the shape of our chain using the curve. I'm going to select our chain, go back into the modifiers tab and find a curve modifier, and then use the eyedropper tool to select our curve. In a lot of cases you'll notice, oh hey, it may not actually be going along the path of the curve, and that could be for a couple reasons. The first reason would be the deform axis. So Blender doesn't actually know how to fit your object to a curve. You have to tell it. So in this case, I'm going to just kind of play with all the options until I find one that looks right. And that looks pretty close along the x-axis. The other reason it might look weird is your transforms could be messed up. So you'll notice if I take this curve and I actually move it away from the origin and away from our setup over here, the transform is not applying correctly at all. And we can fix this simply by setting all of the object's origins, all of the object's transforms, to the same location. So let's say I want to put my whole curve setup over here. Well, how do we get all of our objects to this location? Let's use the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor, which is this right here, is basically a movable work point in Blender that you can rotate objects around, scale objects around, and send objects to. So right now I'm moving it around with Shift and right click, but that's not nearly as precise as what we need. So I'm going to select my target object, and I'm going to hit Shift S, and you'll notice I have this radial menu of options related to the cursor and selections pop up. I want to move the 3D cursor to our selected object, which is down here. And then I'm going to gradually select other objects and move them to the 3D cursor. So I selected that, and I want to move selection to cursor. And now you'll see these are stacked on top of each other at the same point in space. I'm also going to do this to my Bezier curve, so select it, Shift S, selection to cursor, and you'll notice that even though our chain setup is in a completely different point in space, it's no longer at the origin, because all of our objects are stacked on top of each other, it looks perfectly fine. Now that we know that our chain is following the curve, we can select the curve, go into edit mode, and pose it however we like using G for move, R for rotate, and S for scale, which scales up and down the Bezier handles for this type of curve in particular. If I want more than just 2 points on my curve, I can select any of the endpoints and then hit E to extrude to add another point and make increasingly complicated patterns, adjusting the array modifier to have more planes to fill the whole thing as need be. If you want the number of planes to be determined automatically by your curve, you can change the fit type from fixed count to fit curve, and then select your curve object again. And then, no matter how long we make the curve, it will always make more planes to fill it. So the last step to getting a convincing chain look is adding normal maps and other textures. I'm going to show you how I textured these chains in Substance Painter, but I'll also show you a free workflow if you don't have Substance Painter or you don't have texturing experience. Before we even start texturing, we have to set up the UVs. If you don't know what UVs are, basically it's how you take a 3-dimensional object make it flat, and put textures on it. So these are the 2D patterns of this 3D mesh, which I've flattened and then textured on top of. You'll notice in this case the chains share a texture map with stuff like the shirt and the hat, but you can also give the chains a texture map all to their own, and this is what I recommend if you're a beginner artist. I mentioned earlier that if we edit one link in the chain, it edits all of them. And this is also the case for UVs, which is helpful because we want all of our chain links to share the same texture. If I select our chain and go to the UV editing tab, you'll see that we have a workspace that shows us what our current UV map is, as well as a model that we can navigate around and view in 3D. I'm going to put a placeholder texture on our object just so we can see what we're doing in real time. I'm going to select my object, go to the Materials tab, make a new material, and then under Base Color, I'm just going to put in an image of my choice. So Image, Texture, Open, and then you can open any file from your computer. In my case, I went with a UV checker texture, which is just a grid that makes visualizing UVs easier. I'm also going to select it in the UV editor, so Image dropdown, find our UV checker texture, and then this is going to appear on our object. Last step, just to preview it, let's go to these viewport display options, look for the dropdown, and set the color of our object to display as texture. And now we can see it's showing our checker texture on all of our planes. To actually edit our UVs, we need our viewport window, which is this window over here, to be in edit mode. So select our object, hit tab to go into edit mode, and you'll notice we can now edit the vertices in our UV mode. And what happens on our model? Well, the texture updates in real time, the positioning changes. The other thing you may have noticed is the object changes shape when we go between edit and object mode. And that is because by default, not all modifiers show up in edit mode. To fix this, let's go back to our modifiers tab. So go ahead and turn on display in edit mode, just so we can see what our object looks like in real time. Now you can edit your UVs to be whatever you want. In some cases, you might want the chain to only take up part of the space. In other cases, you may want it to take up the whole place. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to leave it as is, but now you know how to edit the UVs should you need to. So now I'm going to teach you how to create a texture for your chain for free with no photo editing or texture editing experience. You could do it in Blender or Substance Painter or Photoshop or whatever you want, but I'm going to teach you how to do it in Photopea because it's something that everybody has because it's on the internet. Photopea is basically like a simplified version of Photoshop that's free. So photopea.com, it's not sponsored, it's just free. So on Photopea, we're going to create a new project and then set our dimensions to something small, like 256 by 256 pixels. It's a chain. It doesn't need to be very big. It could probably be smaller than 256 by 256, but that's what we're going to use for now. And then importantly, we're going to set the background to transparent. Because, of course, we don't want our chain to appear as a bunch of planes. We want it to have the illusion of being a chain link with geometry. So transparent background, and click Create. And you'll notice we have this checkerboard, which indicates that it is in fact transparent. And we're literally just going to find the circle tool over here, ellipse tool, and we're going to draw it. I've hit V on my keyboard or use this selection to move it around now that I've done drawing. I'm also going to check transform controls. And now I can drag it and rescale it and even rotate it at an angle, which is what I would recommend doing to make it look like a chain. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our circle tool, and I'm going to get rid of the fill because we don't want our chain to have an inside. And I'm going to add a stroke, which is like the outline around our chain. I'm going to set it to white for now, but you can make it any color you want. And I'm going to change the stroke thickness like so. Because I made the stroke thickness bigger, you'll know it's kind of escaping from the outside of our texture, which we don't want. So I'm going to go to this drop down and set the position to be on the inside, which just means that the stroke happens on the inside of the shape. We now have a very basic chain texture, and you can jazz this up all you want by adding details or whatever. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to File, Export As, and save it as a PNG. And this is important that we save it as a PNG because we want it to keep our transparent background. If we saved it as a JPEG, it would not save its transparent background. And then I'm just going to save it to my computer. Finally, the things that makes these chains look good and makes them look 3D is a normal map. Photopea does let you create basic normal maps from images. The thing is we can't have a transparent background for it to work. So I'm going to make a new layer, drag it below our chain layer, and then go to the Paint Bucket tool. It's hiding behind the Gradient tool. And then fill it in with black. We also want the normal map to do our whole image, not just the top layer, not just the bottom layer, so we need to flatten it. I'm going to select my top layer, right-click, and then merge down. And that will make it all nice and flat image. It's just one layer. And finally, we can go to Filter, 3D, Normal Map. And you'll notice it's magically changed color, and that's because all of these colors represent the different directions that a normal map can tell light to bounce. So we can adjust exactly how smooth we want our chain to be. So I'm going to add a little bit of blur here. And that looks pretty good to me. And then I'm going to click Invert. And that's because different pieces of software recognize different types of normal maps as correct. So in some cases, this could be concave, whereas in other cases it could be convex. And in our case, we want to click Invert so our normal map will look correct. So let's click OK. And I'm going to File, Export, just like I did the other image. And now we can put this on our chain in Blender just to see if it looks right before we get started in Unity. So I'm going to replace our UV checker texture with the chain texture we just created. And I'm also going to test out the normal map by going under Normal, adding a normal map, and then under Color, adding our image texture that we just created for our normal map. For the normal map specifically, we need to change the color space from sRGB to non-color, and that's just a specific thing when you're dealing with normal maps. If we go to preview it, you'll notice it's still not transparent. So what we need to do is go to the Shading tab and simply connect the alpha of our chain texture, chain.png, right here, to the alpha of our shader. And then when we preview it, you'll see that it looks like a three-dimensional chain, but it's really still just those planes. When we take the normal map off, the illusion breaks somewhat, but when we put it back on, it looks all 3D. For more advanced texture artists or for Substance Painter users, here's what I did in order to create my chain look. First, the UVs of every individual chain link is actually offset, so there's no overlapping planes. Substance Painter does not like when you try and texture on a surface and there are two pieces of geometry in the same spot. The easiest way to fix this is in the array modifier, you can choose to offset the U and V by 1, which will automatically make it so that none of your planes are overlapping. Then back inside of Substance Painter, inside of Substance Painter, I actually did the texturing. Most of the links are just 2 or 3 layers, one to control the texture in alpha, and then another to control the normal map. This link right here is actually just a built-in Substance Painter alpha called Circle Partial. And I just dragged it onto my UV like so, as a mask. And this alpha just controls the opacity, color, metalness, and roughness. So I did my best to make it look like metallic gold. And then under the mask properties and under my circle partial, I just made it so that it went the full loop, changed how thick I wanted it, then kind of just positioned it around to wherever I needed it to be. So in this case, you can see I'm sticking it sort of next to the star for demonstration purposes. You'll notice this doesn't look very three-dimensional, and that's because we're not taking advantage of any height maps or normal maps. What we could do is go back into our layer and add height property and then drag it up or down, but then it gets weirdly sharp on the edges and still doesn't quite look like a rounded 3D object. What I did was I duplicated the layer, and you could do this with anchor points if you wanted to, but I just duplicated the layer, went back into that mask property, added an effect, added a filter, and then looked for blur, which is going to smooth out that layer mask. It's basically just blurring that partial circle. And then I'm going to turn everything off but that height. And then now if I change the height, you'll see because the mask is blurred, it has a much smoother effect than just putting height on that base layer. So here it is with the blurred height, and then here it is with the regular height. There's a huge difference. And now that we've checked our geometry, our UV maps, and made our texture, our chain is done. You can add it to pretty much any avatar, you can weight paint it, you can import it straight into Unity if you want, but this is a much more optimized solution compared to the very high poly chains you saw at the start of the video. And the last thing to note is because these chains use transparent textures, at this time they are only compatible on PC and not on Quest. Hopefully though, if the new VRChat Toon shader gets an update for cutout in the future, we might be able to do chains on Quest, but as of right now, not so much. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you'll optimize your avatars. And if you like what I do, it would mean a lot if you could check out my store where I sell all kinds of assets, including assets that use these chains if you want to check them out. So yeah, check it out if you want to support me. Otherwise, I will see you in future tutorial and other videos. Thank you.